Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Yeah, I felt my own. She's doing a really nice job. I felt my own feelings there. It's created. Around 65,000. Wow. Within 3 weeks. Lots of that was gone. All this stuff.
Morning. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yep. Good morning. I didn't want to do something to mess up the portable mic. So Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. This is a really special morning for us because we have our honored speaker and then also the honoree for whom this lecture is named. Dr. Charles Smith is one of our premier internists in our community, and we are very fortunate to have him here today. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of this lecture. He reminded us last night that this is the 29th Charles Smith lecture, and the very first lecture was actually given by his brother, who is still a faculty member at UT Southwest in Dallas. So a very premier family in internal medicine. So this lectureship was actually endowed by Dr. Letitia Kimsey, and she was a former teacher, followed great interest Dr. Smith's medical career. And among those admirers of Dr. Smith has been members of the admissions committee who approved his application for admissions to the University of Louisville in 1951. Dr. Kimsey's husband, Armour Taylor, was a patient of Dr. Charles Smith, and they had a very close relationship, sharing, among other things, satisfaction and pleasure derived from teaching other people. Mr. Taylor was not a physician, but as a patient, he was fascinated by Dr. Smith's bedside teaching of tutorial students. And the sentiments expressed in a letter written by one of Dr. Smith's former tutorial students attest to the devotion and respect that he has for the distinguished physician. Dr. Charles Smith is very close, in my mind, to an ideal physician in his commitment to teaching, staying current with new developments, bedside manner, attention to his patients, and commitment to his church and family. And I think even though he retired, I believe those attributes are continuing even till today. This lectureship was established in honor of Dr. Smith and as a memorial to his dear friend and patient, Armour Hugh Platt Taylor. And so I hope you'll join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Smith. So I'm very pleased that we were able to have Dr. Jeff Glasheen join us for Grand Rounds this morning. It has only taken me 2 years to try to convince him to come based on his schedule, and so I was really happy that this happened. Dr. Glasheen is a professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, where he is the director of the University of Colorado Hospital Medicine Group and the Associate Dean for Clinical Affairs, Quality and Safety Education. And that's something that we're all working towards here, and I'm hopeful that we can get some pearls on how to start doing a better job of this. Dr. Glasheen was an Alpha Omega Alpha graduate at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, completed his residency training, including a chief residency year at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center. He serves as an assistant program director in the internal medicine residency training program and has developed the residency's hospitalist training program which has offered comprehensive hospitalist training to internal medicine residents since actually 2004. So I would venture to guess that's a fairly long-standing program in that history. In 2012, he was named the director of the University of Colorado's Institute for Healthcare Quality, Safety, and Efficiency. The pioneering program is charged with enhancing the quality and safety of the care provided at the University of Colorado Hospital and Children's Hospital, Colorado. He is a member of the Society of Hospital Medicine Board of Directors and past chair of the Society of Hospital Medicine Academic and Annual Committee meetings. He is a member of the American Board of Internal Medicine Task Force charged with developing the recognition of focused patient practice in hospital medicine, board certification for hospitalists. He was the course director for the 2010 Academic Hospitalist Leadership Summit and is the director of the Academic Hospitalist Academy, an annual 4-day meeting aimed at developing early academic hospitalist career skills. And I believe Dr. Dews actually has attended that conference. He has served as the assistant course director for the Society of Hospital Medicine annual meeting in 2011, course director for the 2012 meeting in San Diego. He is a past winner of the Society of Hospital Medicine Award for Excellence in Teaching, former editor of the Hospitalist News magazine, and currently serves as the senior deputy editor of the Journal of Hospital Medicine. I had the other program directors and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at one of our program directors meeting about this topic, and I am exceedingly pleased that Dr. Glasheen could join us from Colorado. And his discussion today is 97,999 and Florence, creating a culture of safety. Dr. Glasheen.
All right. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Casper, and thank you, Dr. Smith, for having the honor of being able to present at your lectureship. And thank you all for having me. It certainly is an honor and a privilege to be able to present to all of you today. So, as Barbara had mentioned, the title of my talk is 97,999 in Florence, but what I really want to talk about is what lives in that subheading there, this concept of creating culture around patient safety. But before we do that, there are two quick things I have to do. First, I have to start with my disclosures, and I think as you look through there, you'll see nothing that conflicts our topic today. Second thing I wanted to do is I wanted to start with a case that I think will help us frame our discussion here today. So let's start by meeting Tina. So Tina was a 47-year-old woman who had a cough for 1 month. Now the good news for Tina is that her cough spontaneously improved. The bad news is 10 days later she developed fatigue, shortness of breath, and lower extremity edema. She was admitted to the hospital where she was diagnosed with a post-viral cardiomyopathy and unfortunately continued to deteriorate to the point that she required a heart transplant. The good news for Tina is that a month after her transplant, she was actually discharged to home. Now, after she went home on days 1 and 2, she was doing well, but by day 3, she was more dyspneic. Day 4, she was more overtly short of breath. Day 5, she had an 8-pound weight gain. She was admitted back to the hospital, and on day 6, underwent a cardiac biopsy, which showed grade 2 cardiac rejection. Now, this is not the normal course for a patient with a cardiac transplant, so the doctors and nurses involved in Tina's case did exactly what any one of us here in this room would have done, and that is they asked the question of what went wrong. So they reviewed her course, starting with her pre-op course. Now, this was a woman who was gravely ill. She spent the better part of a month in the ICU on a vent, dialysis, balloon pump. They looked at her operative course. I don't have to tell all of you, cardiac transplant's a big deal. It's multi-hour surgery. It has to be highly choreographed. They looked at her post-op course. Again, she spent about a month in the hospital. They had to get her off the vent, get her doing her ADLs, get her off dialysis. And when the team of doctors and nurses reviewed that case, that very complex, complicated technical care, what they found is that they got it all right. So then they looked at her discharge. And specifically, they looked at her medications. Now, this is a list of the medicines that Tina was on the last day that she was in the hospital. You get the sense that she was on a lot of medicine. She has medicines for her heart. There's aspirin and metoprolol up there on the top of that second column. She had some immunosuppressants. There's mycophenolate and prednisone and many other medicines for chronic medical issues. So Tina was on a lot of medicines. In fact, the last day that she was in the hospital, she was taking 21 medicines. The problem is she was in home with only 20. Any idea which one of these medicines the team of doctors forgot to send her home with? Yeah, you guys, you've seen this case before, haven't you? It's the mycophenolate, right? Now, how is that possible? That this team of highly specialized, trained, dedicated, passionate providers can get all that very complex stuff right, and then miss something arguably as simple as the most important medicine she needs to go home with. Well, hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that here in a second. But before we do, I wanted to let you know how Tina did. So she was started back on the mycophenolate, continued to deteriorate, was admitted back to the ICU. Now, the good news is that she did pretty well. 3 or 4 weeks later, she was stabilized and went home. So no harm, no foul, right? Not exactly. Turns out she'd been in and out of the hospital for the better part of 6 months, which meant that she had lost her job, which meant that she had no health insurance, which meant that she had quite the start when she got the bill in the mail from the hospital for well over $1 million. Now, Tina and her family couldn't pay that bill, so they ended up declaring bankruptcy. Now, I start with this case not to depress you or to ruin your breakfast. Rather, I start with this case because I want to drive home the point that when we make mistakes, our mistakes have consequences. And by and large, it is our patients that suffer those consequences. So keep this case in mind, because I think as we go through the rest of the discussion here today, you're going to see a lot of these themes play out. Well, what is it that we're going to talk about today? I have 3 main objectives. I wanted to start by discussing the current state of patient safety, talk a little bit about how we might improve, and then finish by spending the bulk of the time on this concept of creating a culture of patient safety. So what I wanted to do is start with the first point there, this current state of patient safety, and I want to start with the good news, and that is that you all are very, very good at your jobs. This has actually been studied. Israeli ICU, they follow around doctors and nurses, and what they found, looking at how often we get it right, is that we are 99% proficient. We get it right 99% of the time. We get it right nearly every single time. Pretty impressive. Or is it? Well, it turns out that medicine is a high-risk industry. And 99% is unacceptable for high-risk industries. In fact, let's take a look at what 99% would look like in some other industries. Start with the post office. What if the post office were to get it right 99% of the time? Well, that would equal 16,000 lost pieces of mail each and every hour of each and every day. Might actually be pretty good for the post office. Who knows? About the finance industry, right? Much maligned of late. What if the banking industry got this thing right 99% of the time? Well, that would equal 32,000 check deductions from the wrong bank account each and every hour. Airline, what if the aviation industry got it right 99% of the time? Well, that would equal 2 unsafe plane landings at Denver International Airport, my home airport, in every other airport throughout the United States, every single day. This would be unacceptable, right? Well, this is what 99% looks like in other industries. And this is what it looks like in ours. This is the Institute of Medicine report you've all seen from 1999, estimated somewhere between 44,000 and 98,000 deaths from medical errors in hospitals every year. Now, these aren't patients coming into the hospital with pneumonia and dying of pneumonia. These are people coming into the hospital with pneumonia and dying of a pulmonary embolism because we forgot to put them on VTE prophylaxis. If you still chose to think of it this way, medical error in hospitals would be the 8th leading cause of death in the United States, ahead of motor vehicle accidents, breast cancer, AIDS. In fact, you add those 3 up, you get less than 98,000. Now, this is just deaths from medical errors in hospitals. If you look across the entire spectrum, inpatient, outpatient nursing facilities, medical error would be the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, behind only cancer and cardiovascular disease. This is what 99% looks like in our industry. And this is what it looks like graphically. This is deaths per million opportunities. On the y-axis here, you have the number of deaths per million opportunities. X-axis, you have various activities. If you walk all the way over here, you'll see aviation. Well, actually, you won't see aviation. Because despite the fact that we all harbor like at least a little bit of a fear of dying in a plane crash, it's actually really hard to do so, right? Less than 1 death per million opportunities. Anesthesia, part of healthcare that gets it right. About 1 death per million opportunities. Motor vehicle accidents. I can't open up my local newspaper without seeing a fatal car crash. About 100 deaths per million opportunities. Firearms, huge hot button issue in the US. About 700 deaths per million opportunities. And then, of course, there's fishing. I got to tell you, I grew up in northern Wisconsin, which meant that I spent the bulk of my formative years in a boat with drunk men fishing. And even I was a little surprised at how mortal fishing was. Well, it turns out this isn't recreational fishing. This is occupational fishing, which is the most dangerous job in the United States. 1,300 deaths per million opportunities, and there's us. Hospital adverse drug events claim about 1,300 deaths per million opportunities. Hospital care in general, 6,000 deaths per million opportunities. Now, it turns out we have these things in life that we tend to fear, these things in life that we tend to trust. And by and large, completely backwards. So this is what 99% looks like graphically. And this is what it looks like to our patients. This is Reader's Digest, February of 2003. You can see it just screams at us, right? Fatal hospital mistake. Now, the good news is that the Digest has solved this problem for us if we'll just turn to page 9. Well, our patients care about this. And the reason I know our patients care about this is that fatal hospital mistakes trumps not only sex down there at the bottom, but perhaps more impressively, Richard Gere's surprise and path to happiness. I know we all care about tremendously, right? Well, now, lest you think that Reader's Digest solved this problem for us back in February of 2003, here's Reader's Digest, June of 2007, same exact title, Fatal Hospital Mistakes. Once again, all the answers will be revealed if we just read the digest, right? Well, there's an interesting transposition on this slide. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see Angelina Jolie. Now, Angelina, she's saving the world one child at a time. Bless her heart. And then in the other corner, you have this battle-weary surgeon who's just knocking patients off left and right. Our patients care about this. And so what are we going to do about this? How can we improve safety? Well, a lot of people have talked about this, and they'll say, well, maybe what we need to do is to select and train our physicians to have a stronger ethical bond. And if we just cared a little bit more, we wouldn't stomach the idea of having an error. Maybe we need to offer incentives that result in better quality and safety is the idea behind pay for performance, that if we pay doctors more, they will make less mistakes. Or maybe we need to reduce the cognitive and psychological burdens that lead to error. This is the idea behind the duty hour restrictions, right? That less sleepy residents will make less errors. Or maybe we just need smarter doctors, right? Give us more knowledge, and we will make less errors. I'll submit to you that there are a lot of great ideas up there for improving the quality and safety of care in the U.S. But I would also submit to you that the way that we're going to fundamentally improve quality and safety in the United States is not on that slide. For that, we have to turn, of course, to the U.S. Army. Now, if you go back to the early 1930s, the U.S. government was looking at the increasing likelihood of getting drawn into World War II, and the U.S. Army looked at that and said, boy, if we have to fight an intercontinental battle, we're going to need to have a better long-range bomber. So they put out a request for proposal to all the major airplane manufacturers asking them to build them a better long-range bomber. And on October 30th, 1935, they held a flight competition. And you can see 3 airplane manufacturers showed up, Martin, Boeing, and Douglas. And just looking at that middle plane there, that Boeing plane, you get the sense there's something special. It's nearly twice as big as its competitors. It can carry 5 times as many bombs, fly both faster and farther. So it was a bit of a foregone conclusion. The Army is going to buy 65 of these Boeing model planes. Well, here's a picture of the Boeing B-299, and you can get the sense it's a majestic plane. It had a 103-foot wingspan. It had 4 engines. In fact, it was the first plane ever to have 4 engines. Every other plane, including its competitors, only had 2 engines. Well, the B-299 taxied onto the runway that morning, roared down the tarmac, lifted off smoothly, and quickly climbed to 300 feet. Where you guessed it stalled, turned on one and crashed in a fiery explosion. Now, 2 of the 5 crew members died that day, including the pilot, Major Ployer P. Hill. Now, there's 2 things I think you should know about Major Hill. Number 1 is he had like one of the all-time coolest first names, Ployer. If you name your kid Ployer, that guy's going to end up being a fighter pilot. Cool, man. Second thing about Major Hill is that he was one of, if not the most decorated and highly skilled pilots in the entire U.S. Army. So this was a bit of a head-scratcher for folks at Boeing that one of the world's best pilots would crash their prototype plane. So the engineers at Boeing did exactly what our doctors did in Tina's case, and that is they asked the question of what went wrong. So they examined the wreckage, and they could find no evidence of mechanical failure. Therefore, they concluded that this had to be pilot error. which again was confusing because Major Hill was such a great pilot. But what they started to recognize is that this was a substantially more complex plane than anything that had come before. It had 4 engines, and retractable landings, new wing flaps, and electric trim tabs, and constant speed propellers, all of which needed constant monitoring and adjustments. And it turns out that just like our doctors in Tina's case, Major Hill got all this very complex, complicated, highly technical stuff right. But also, just like our doctors in Tina's case, he got tripped up by something very, very simple. I told you this was a giant plane, right? It was such a big plane that it had to have a big rudder on the back of the plane to help it maneuver when it got airborne. It turns out that engineers at Boeing were concerned that when that plane sat on the tarmac, that big rudder would blow in the wind and damage itself. So they did the logical thing, which is they put a locking mechanism on that rudder. And it turns out while Major Hill was thinking of all this higher order cognitive stuff, he simply forgot to take that locking mechanism off the rudder. The plane got airborne, was unable to maneuver, and crashed. Well, the next day, the newspapers reported that this was just too much plane for one man to fly. And it turns out that the U.S. Army tended to agree. They bought these smaller, easier to operate planes, and Boeing almost went bankrupt. But Boeing didn't go bankrupt, because Boeing had a solution for this problem of too much plane for one man to fly. And that solution was checklists. They developed simple step-by-step checks for takeoff, flight, landing, and taxiing, so that every step of the way, while pilots were thinking this higher-order cognitive stuff, they wouldn't forget something as simple as taking that locking mechanism off the rudder. But subsequent to that, Internet 9 flew nearly 2 million miles without an accident. The U.S. government eventually did buy the plane. They turned it into the B-17 bomber, which became the deciding advantage in the World War II bombing campaign against Germany. Well, I think in much the same way, healthcare has the same problem of too much plane for one man or one woman to fly. We're doing incredibly complex stuff, and we're doing it in hospitals, which are complex systems that are prone to error. And I think we're starting to get the sense that most errors don't result from a lack of education, knowledge, or caring. Rather, most errors result from simple human mistakes. Forgetting to write a prescription for mycophenolate. It's the fallibility of the human condition. Therefore, our solution cannot be to try to train clinicians to do the right thing under all circumstances, because as human beings, we will find a way to mess it up. Right? Rather, what we need to do is improve the systems so that they won't allow us to do the wrong thing, to build systems that are so safe that even if we wanted to hurt patients, the system wouldn't allow it. The problem is, for most of us, this is not intuitive, right? Nor, to be frank, did we go to school to do this, right? I mean, show of hands, how many people went to medical school to become assistants engineers? Not many of us, right? Well, hold this thought. I'm going to hit the pause button for a second. We're going to come back to this here in a second. But before I do that, I want to introduce you to Jim. Now, Jim is a 61-year-old man admitted with right lower extremity cellulitis. His admission orders included things like antibiotics, DT prophylaxis, and pain medicines. On day 2, Jim developed frank hematochezia. He was transferred to the ICU, where he was resuscitated with PAP cells, underwent a colonoscopy, which revealed bleeding diverticula. Now, the good news for Jim is that he was a little bit debilitated, but eventually went to rehab and was discharged home 12 days later. Now, this is not the normal course for a patient with cellulitis, so the doctors involved in Jim's case did exactly what the doctors did in Tina's case. That is, they asked the question of what went wrong. So this time, they actually looked at Jim's admission orders. Now, this is pre-EMR, electronic health records, so this is actually handwritten. A little hard to read, so let me read it for you. It says it has vancomycin 1 gram IV BID. There's acetaminophen 1,000 milligrams POQ6 PI fever. That's MSO4, so morphine 1 milligram IV Q6, and then heparin 5,000 units sub-Q BID. Or is it heparin 50,000 sub-Q BID? Well, I can tell you that the unit clerk who took this order off was heparin 50,000 sub-Q BID. I can tell you the nurse administered heparin 50,000 sub-Q BID. And furthermore, I can tell you that the person who wrote this order intended it to be heparin 5,000 units sub-Q BID. And the reason I can tell you that is because I'm the person who wrote that order nearly 20 years ago as a medical student. I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there thinking, there's no way an error like that would happen today, right? Because we all know that U is an unapproved abbreviation for unit. And of course, nobody would ever use an unapproved abbreviation, right? Well, I can guarantee you this same kind of error is still happening today. And furthermore, I can tell you it's been going on for a lot longer than 20 years. In fact, in most cases, we can trace the same timeline all the way back to the 4th century BC, and Hippocrates, who uttered those famous words of first do no harm. Well, if we fast forward to the 1850s, Florence Nightingale railed against the unsafe patient care in the Crimean War front, and later that decade, Semmelweis challenged providers to wash their hands to stem the tide of puerperal sepsis. 1910, Codman implored physicians to study outcomes, remedy errors, and make our results public. Over 100 years later, we're still struggling with exactly how transparent we want to be with our outcomes. Fully 24 centuries after Hippocrates, healthcare remains unsafe. In the 1980s, the Harvard Medical Practice Study found that 4% of hospitalized patients were injured by their care, 2/3 of which was preventable, meaning it didn't have to happen. If you take that 4% of patients that are injured by their care, you look at the percentage of them that died from those injuries, and you extrapolate that over the entire population, what you get is that Institute of Medicine estimated 98,000 deaths from medical errors in hospitals. Right? Similar study done in Colorado and Utah. Take the same data, do the calculus on that, you'll come up with that estimated 44,000. So if you ever wondered where that estimated 44,000 to 98,000 deaths from medical errors in hospitals come from, it's from those two studies. 2000, the IHI estimated there was 15 million episodes of harm in the U.S. every year. That means today, the day is still young, 40,000 patients are going to be harmed by the care we provide. 2006, World Health Organization declared that serious preventable adverse events occur in 10% of hospital stays. So to put that in perspective, I think your hospital is around 400 beds here. So if statistically speaking, if you're full and that holds, that means today 40 patients who are in your hospital are going to suffer a serious adverse event during their stay that didn't have to happen. Some of the most recent data, 2010, showed an 18% case rate of harm for hospitalized patients, 63% deemed preventable. Again, almost the exact same number we saw 30 years ago in that Harvard Medical Practice study. Perhaps the most concerning finding from that study was this. There was no change in the rate of harm between 2002 and 2007. So despite the fact that we've poured more than a decade of time, money, and resource into this problem, it doesn't seem to be getting better. Why? Well, I think there was lots of reasons why, but in my opinion, one of the biggest ones is that we've yet to create that true culture of patient safety. Let me again hit the pause button and introduce to you one more patient. This one is Sarah. Now, Sarah is a 51-year-old woman who was admitted to the ICU with severe community-acquired pneumonia. She's intubated, started on broad-spectrum antibiotics. By day 2, she's getting better. Day 3, she's actually off the vent, but by day 5, she takes a turn for the worse, develops severe sepsis from a femoral line infection. Day 6, that line is out. Day 10, she's on orals, and day 14, she's discharged to home. My question for you in Sarah's case is, did a medical error happen? In other words, does a femoral line infection represent a medical error? Yes, no, hard to say, right? But what's not hard to say is that she suffered an adverse event. And a femoral line infection is an adverse event, and the real question is that central line infection preventable, or was it inevitable? In other words, is there something we can do to avoid line infections, or are line infections just the price of admission to the ICU? Well, let's take a look at the concept of line infections, and specifically, let's look at the Keystone Project. Now, a little bit of background. Catheter-related bloodstream infections are common, impacting by 80,000 patients a year. They're deadly, killing up to 60,000 patients a year, and they cost a lot of money. So it's not surprising people would be interested in trying to lower the rates of line infections. So Peter Pronovost and his colleagues out at Johns Hopkins decided to look at this question, specifically that question of preventability of line infections. And what they did is they created a 5-step checklist of things they thought all providers should do in and around placing a central line. They rolled that checklist out in their ICUs, and they saw amazing results. So then they decided to take their show on the road. And where did they go? Michigan, which is the Keystone Project. They implemented that 5-step checklist in 103 ICUs throughout the state of Michigan. Nearly every single ICU in the state of Michigan participated. You can see the 5 things they asked providers to do. Wash your hands, clean the skin with chlorhexidine, barrier precautions, avoid the groin site, the femoral site like Sarah had, and take out unnecessary catheters. As you look at that list, I don't think you're going to find anything too objectionable. Right? So they rolled out this 5-step, 103 ICUs throughout the entire state of Michigan, and here were the results. The median rate of line infections per 1,000 catheter days before the intervention was 2.7. 3 months after the intervention, it was 0. 18 months after the intervention, it was 0. They had effectively wiped out line infections in the entire state of Michigan, providing even further evidence, along with what we saw with Boeing, that these checklists really can work. The problem is, most often they don't. Now, after that Keystone project, the Department of Health and Human Services was very enthused about lowering the rates of line infections. They, in fact, came out and said that we are going to lower the rate of line infections in the U.S. by 50% in 3 years. They implored all states to do exactly what they did in Michigan. Well, it turns out only 11 states signed up, and not a single one was able to replicate what they did in Michigan. In fact, not a single hospital was able to get their rates down to 0. Why? Well, I think what we started to recognize is that we are swimming against very strong social and cultural currents, that physicians are famously autonomous, and we believe in our professional independence. And we don't want to be told that we have to follow a protocol or a checklist, because that feels like cookbook medicine. And at the end of the day, a checklist is nothing more than a technical solution to what is ultimately a cultural problem. And to give you an example, I'll go back to that Keystone. It's not like those investigators just sort of walked into 150 ICUs one day and dropped off a 5-step checklist of things we all know we're supposed to do and said, we'll see you in 18 months. No, they were in those ICUs for up to 6 months prior to rolling those checklists out. And what were they doing? They were doing this. They were working on the culture thing. They were working to create that kind of culture that would not accept a medical error, would accept a QI initiative like a checklist. And it was only after that 6 months of culture change that they dared roll out those checklists. Now, that didn't happen in the other 11 states, and it's likely why those other states didn't see the benefit. So after Keystone, we started to get the sense that these kind of initiatives only work if they're inserted into a culture of safety. So with that, I wanted to move into the third and final part of my discussion here today and talk about how we might begin to create that kind of culture that won't accept medical error and will accept a QI initiative such as a checklist. And what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through 8 steps to do this. 8 steps that all begin with a burning platform. Now, many years ago, there was an oil rig in the North Sea, and one day there was an explosion on that oil rig. And one of the crew members ran up to the top of that platform. But when he got up there, he looked around, and all he saw was smoke and flame. So he ran over to the edge of that platform. And when he got there, he turned around, and all he saw was an encroaching wall of flame. He looked to his right, saw nothing but an encroaching wall of flame. Looked to his left, an encroaching wall of flame. So he looked down. And what he saw was a 100-foot drop down to the icy, frigid North Sea, the surface of which was strewn with burning oil and debris. And he thought to himself, if I jump, I'm almost certainly going to die from a 10-story drop. And even if I don't, I'll die within minutes of exposure in the frigid waters. So standing there, surrounded by flame, what did he do? He jumped. He jumped. He survived the fall, was swiftly rescued and taken ashore, where one of the journalists who was interviewed him asked him this question. He said, man, what were you thinking jumping from a 100-foot platform knowing that you were probably going to die? And this is what he said. He said, it's better to face probable death than it is to face certain death. And the moral of that story, as it applies to what we're talking about now, is that change is really hard. And it often takes the equivalent of near certain death to get people to take that leap, to take that plunge, to make that change. So I would ask you, what's it going to take in healthcare? What's going to be our burning platform? Are 98,000 deaths from medical errors, is that not enough? Do we need 200,000? Do we need 1 million? Well, I would submit to you that 98,000 deaths is more than enough. And it's not so much that our platform is not on fire. It is. It's just that we've yet to recognize the flame. And this is one of the key concepts in culture change, is that before anybody's going to change, they've got to think there's a problem. And I would submit to you that the problem with quality and safety in the United States is that most providers don't think there's a problem with quality and safety in the United States. And until we change that perception, we can never change our culture. So what we need to do is we need to create a sense of urgency for that change. We need to create that burning platform. And for us to do that requires our second step, which is leadership. Now let me tell you what I don't mean by leadership. I don't mean the person in charge. I don't mean a position of power. I don't mean the autocrat. Right? Rather, my definition of leadership is this. It's the ability to get people to go someplace they otherwise wouldn't have gone, to inspire people to take a path that they otherwise wouldn't have taken. And I would submit to you, that's not just the job of our dean and our chair and our hospital CEO, right? In fact, in most cases, I tell you, these people, they're not the right people to lead this kind of change. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Does anybody here remember junior high? You guys remember junior high, like middle school, whatever, 6th, 7th, 8th grade? You guys remember that? No? You just like whitewashed that entire time period out of your memory, right? All right. Well, you guys remember those junior high dances? Remember those things like Friday night, 7 p.m., the junior high dinner? Remember how painful those things were? Like sweaty palms, back and forth, right? I think most of those things went down the same way, right? You'd show up and you'd go in, there'd be a dance floor, a crystal ball, some pimple-headed teenager spinning all the hits, right? And you'd walk in and there'd be like a fast song on it, right? All the kids would be out there like reluctantly kind of hopping around. You'd walk in and you'd think, oh man, this is so painful. And just thought it couldn't get any more painful. What would happen? Slow song. Yeah, the fast song would go off and the lights would come down and a slow song would come on, right? And then what would happen? All the kids would just like vacate the dance floor, right? There'd be nothing but like crickets and tumbleweeds, and all the dudes would be over on one side of the bleachers and all the girls on the other side of the bleachers, right? And you'd be like, oh man, this is so painful. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more painful, what would happen? Well, invariably one of the guys would get up. Right? In my class, it was always Johnny. Now, Johnny, he was like the cool guy. He's the guy that all of the girls wanted to date and all of the guys wanted to be like, right? And Johnny, he was like a confident lad, right? Which is probably why he was so cool. And he would get up and he would slowly strut past all of us guys over to that gaggle of girls. Johnny would pick out the cutest girl. In my class was Sarah. And Johnny would ask Sarah to slow dance, and Sarah would say yes, and they would pair up and they would head out to the dance floor to slow dance, right? And then what would happen? Within moments, all of the kids would be paired up following Johnny and Sarah out to the dance floor, right? Now, if we rewind that story back to the vacant dance floor, the crickets and the tumbleweeds, what if instead of Johnny, the cool kid, asking Sarah, the good-looking girl, to go out and dance, what if instead of that, the principal had asked the vice principal? How many people would have followed the principal and the vice principal out to slow dance? 0, right? Well, we cannot depend upon our principals and our vice principals to lead this kind of change. It has to be Johnny and Sarah, right? And in that analogy, my friends, you guys are Johnny and Sarah. Quality needs leaders. You are its leaders. Now, that's not to say the dean, the chair, and the hospital CEO get a complete pass. They do not. They play a very important role. That's around providing support and resource. But if we're going to get this done, this leadership has to come from the front line. The people who interact with these systems every single day, it has to come from us. Let me give you an example. We'll go back to that Keystone project. Now, this is the leadership team they had in place in every one of those ICUs. Every one of those ICUs had a senior executive. They were there, but they were there to provide resource. The real work was being done by a nurse and a physician in every ICU, Johnny and Sarah, working together with the frontline staff to roll it out, to do the education, to remove barriers. Quality needs leadership, and we are its Johnny's and Sarah's. So let's summarize. We've got our first 2 steps. We've got that burning platform, that encroaching wall of flame, that sense of urgency that drives people to the edge of the platform and gets them ready to change. Now we've got our leadership, our Johnny's and our Sarah's. The third step is to translate our sense of urgency into a vision. Now, let me tell you what I mean by the vision. The vision is the end game. It's the end zone. It's that thing off in the distance, that great big audacious goal that we are all collectively striving for. Let me tell you what the vision is not. Vision is not plans. Right? Plans are good. Plans are important. Turns out plans are step forward. But plans that don't tie back to a vision are destined to fail. I'll give you an example. Anybody here remember the 2006 presidential election? You guys remember this? There's was just like 6 years ago. You guys, right? It's Barack Obama and John McCain, right? Does anyone remember what Barack Obama told the rich? Remember, he self-defined the rich as those making more than $250,000 a year. And he looked the rich in the eye and he said, "Rich, you vote for me, I'm going to raise your taxes." And what did the rich do? They voted for it, right? More people making more than $250,000 a year voted for Barack Obama than they did John McCain. Why? It's because they loved that plan, that they wanted to pay more taxes, they wanted to give more money to the government. No, I'm sure the rich hated that plan. But they believed in the vision. They believed in what he was trying to do, and therein lies the power behind a great vision. It inspires people to overcome and sacrifice for plans they may not like, as long as they can see how that plan that they don't like ties back to a vision that they do like. So there's a power in these vision statements. If you're going to have if you're going to try to change culture, you have to have a vision for that. You have to show people this vision because there's a power in that collective vision. It allows people to sacrifice. Ultimately, vision statements need to be inspirational and aspirational. In fact, let me share with you one of my favorite vision statements around safety. It comes to us from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. As many of you may know, the BI was really on sort of the early vanguard of patient safety. They've been doing this now for well over a decade. And what I like about their vision statement is that it's very, very short, but it's also very, very sweet. And here it is. The BI will eliminate all preventable harm. Period. Wow. Now that's audacious, right? But it's also inspiring. Like, this is the kind of thing I could get behind because I don't want to hurt patients, and I certainly don't want to be part of the organization that's going to get rid of, like, some of the preventable harm. Get rid of all of the preventable harm. And as plans come down the pipe that I don't like, and I'm talking about you, medication reconciliation, and I'm talking about you, electronic health record, I don't like those plans. Well, as long as I can see how those plans that I don't like tie back to a vision I do like, not hurting patients, I'm going to be much more likely to do the plan. All right? Plans that don't tie back to visions are destined to fail. We've got a burning platform, our Johnny's and Sarah's. We've now got our powerful emotive vision. Step number 4 is to translate that vision into some strategy. Now, lots of strategy for quality. We don't have time to go through all of it, but one of them that I did want to go through, which I think is germane to this group, is around educational reform. We simply cannot continue to train square pegs and stuff them into round holes, right? We can't continue to train our providers and our nurses one way and expect them to come out the back end being systems engineers. If this is what we continue to do. Only about 1 in 5 med schools have adopted comprehensive quality and safety curriculum, and even fewer offer a chance to experience examination of patient care processes. Now, in medical education terms, we talk about knowledge, attitudes, and skills. That first sub-bullet is really knowledge and attitudes, and that's important. Our learners need to know about quality, they need to care about quality. But the real goal, the real nirvana is that bottom subject. It's around skills development in quality and safety. Lots of ways to do that. I know you guys are working on this here as well. Let me give you one example from what we've been doing back in Colorado, and it lives within our hospitalist training program that Barbara mentioned earlier. So we've had a hospitalist training program now since 2004. Essentially, residents come in as interns, and then they can choose to join us in the second and third year. We have 12 spots in second years, 12 as third years, and they can spend 7 of their last 24 months studying to be hospitalists. Now, we have a comprehensive clinical program, but that's not the story that we've talked about. What I want to talk about is our focus on skills development, quality, and safety. So we have about 50 hours of curriculum, QI science, healthcare finance, leadership, teamwork, safety. But again, if I'm going to be honest, that's just knowledge and attitudes. And the real goal here is skills development. So each one of our residents develops a quality improvement project with a faculty mentor. They have a month of dedicated time. During that time, they may do a root cause analysis, a process map, a value stream map. They may do a couple of PDSA cycles, and then they have a year and a half to work on that project, such that at the end of this training, they can say, not only do I know about quality, not only do I care about quality, but that I've done quality. Skills development, quality, and safety. One of the key ways we're going to change our culture. We again hit the pause button. We'll come back to this, but I wanted to introduce you to Rory. Rory is a 63-year-old man with hypertension and diabetes who presented to our emergency department with acute right-sided weakness for 45 minutes. Good news for Rory is that his symptoms improved, and he was admitted to our hospital at 9 in the morning with a transient ischemic attack. Well, later that day, at 5 p.m., he again developed right-sided hemiplegia, this time with aphasia. It took the nurse about 30 minutes to recognize Rory's symptoms, at which time she tried to get a hold of the physician, and there was no answer after 3 attempts, at which point she realized there was a different physician covering since it was after 5 p.m., so Rory had to wait. 5:50, physician came and evaluated Rory, ordered a non-contrast head CT. The transport was unavailable, so Rory had to wait. 6:20, Rory got back with a CT scanner, but there was another patient in the scanner, so Rory had to wait. 6:45, head CT was complete. 7:15, it was read by radiology. There was no bleed, meaning he'd be a candidate for IV thrombolytics. This was relayed to the primary doc, who then consulted neurology at 7:35. He received the patient at 8 p.m., now fully 3 hours after the onset of his symptoms, effectively putting Rory out of the generally accepted window for use of IV thrombolytics. Well, Rory didn't get thrombolytics and Rory didn't get better. He was eventually transferred to a nursing home, hemiplegic and aphasia. Now, we know that the most likely time for a patient who suffers a TIA to have a stroke is that first 24 to 48 hours after the TIA. In fact, this right here, this is the exact reason you bring these people in the hospital, so that if they develop a stroke, you can get the thrombolysis. Well, that didn't happen in Rory's case, and the irony of Rory's case is that he would have been better off not coming into our hospital at 9 in the morning. Rather, he'd have been better off going home, calling 911, because we have a very robust system through our emergency department. Get patients head CT in 25 minutes, thrombolytics in under an hour. While that existed in our emergency department, it didn't exist in our hospital. That's a broken system. It just so happens that one of our hospitalist residents was involved in Rory's care, and she decided to make this her project. So working together with her faculty member, they did a root cause analysis of the current process. They identified problems in delay of recognition, getting the doc on board, getting the CT, and ultimately therapy. Working together, they decided to improve that process, specifically the communication pathways. They developed an algorithm for who gets called first, how, and by whom. They converted serial actions to occur in parallel, such that at the same time they were getting the CT scan ready, they were also notifying transportation. They clarified who was going to transport this patient, when, and how. They developed checklists so that every person involved in the care of these patients knew exactly what to do at all times, and then they did continuous quality improvement with real-time feedback. And here are the results. So this is in-hospital stroke response time, so not in the emergency department. This is a patient in the hospital who develops TIA or stroke-like symptoms. And then this on the y-axis is a median time from stroke alert to CAT scan. And you can see before the intervention, we were at 69 minutes, average. Now in stroke care, there's this thing called the golden hour. So while there's known benefit of thrombolytics 3 hours, maybe even 4.5 hours out, the real benefit comes in that first 60 minutes, within that golden hour. We were spending our golden hour just wheeling patients down to the CT scanner. Shortly after the intervention, you can see we got it down to 37 minutes. 6 months later, it was down to 30 minutes. I can tell you today, over 4.5 years later, it's at 25 minutes. Exactly the same for a patient who comes to the emergency department. This is pretty neat. But the really neat thing about this is that this was a resident-led project. And the really, really neat thing about that is that that resident is now a hospitalist in the community of Denver doing this exact same kind of work. Skills development and quality and safety, one of the key ways that we're going to change our culture. All right, let's get back into it. We're only through 4 of our 8 steps. Trust me, we'll be done in time. That first step is creating that burning platform, that encroaching moral flame, that sense of urgency. Second step is getting Johnny and Sarah's on board, the frontline leaders. Third step is creating a powerful motive vision. Step number 4 is about creating strategies. Step number 5 then is to remove obstacles. And I'll tell you, this is one of the most important steps in this, and it's one we nearly always get wrong. In fact, let me tell you what I see happen most often, is that a bunch of very sort of passionate, dedicated, smart, intelligent people, they'll hole up in a room somewhere and they're sort of struggling with a QI problem. And invariably the solution that comes out of that room is what? Another form, it's more paperwork, it's more steps in the EMR, it's a pager I have to call to get an antibiotic, right? They make the process harder and wonder why we don't do it. Well, work harder and try harder are not great strategy when it comes to this, right? You can tell me to get my patient's head CT'd in under 30 minutes, but if there are barriers to me doing that, I simply can't do it. So we need to ask ourselves, why are people doing it? What's getting in the way? How do we remove the barriers? How do we take it a step further and make it easier for people to do the right thing? And let me give you an example. Let's go back to that Keystone project. Now, I told you that those investigators were in those ICUs for up to 6 months prior to rolling out the checklist. This is one of the things they were doing, is removing barriers, and one of the major barriers they found was around chlorhexidine. Remember, I told you chlorhexidine was one of the 5 things that they were supposed to do. But it turns out when they looked at it, only about 20% of ICUs actually had chlorhexidine in their central line kits, and only 60% had it anywhere in the ICU. It's a little hard to use chlorhexidine soap if chlorhexidine soap is not available. So before they rolled out the intervention, they made sure it was available, such that by the time they rolled it out, 80% of the ICUs had it in their kits. 100% had it readily available. A great example of not only removing a barrier, but making it easier for people to do the right thing. All right, we've got that vision thing. We've got some strategies. We're removing barriers. Step number 6 is around generating and celebrating short-term wins. And really what this is recognition that change is really hard. And I may care today, and I'll probably care tomorrow, but by next week, I don't know, I've moved on to the next thing, right? Well, we use our short-term wins to keep people engaged every step of the way to the finish line. Let me give you an example. Let's say it's Saturday afternoon, right? And you're like firmly planted on the couch, and you got the remote control, and you're just working that thing hard, right? Just spinning the dial through all the channels until you happen to stumble upon the New York City Marathon. You get inspired. You say, you know what? Next year, I'm going to run the New York City Marathon. And then you sort of puff your chest out a little bit, right? Well, the only problem is that you're a bit of a couch potato, right? In fact, you haven't exercised in like 10 years. In fact, you're like a grade A couch potato, like a 5-foot taproot down into that couch because it's been so long since you've moved. Now, what are the chances that you're going to successfully complete the New York City Marathon if the only thing you get, the only reward you get is 365 days later when you cross that finish line and that happens? 0, right? But that's not what you would do. You'd do something like this. You'd say, today, I'm going to stand up. And then tomorrow, I'm going to move. And then I'm going to walk a mile every single day for a week. And when I've done that, I'm going to go out and celebrate with my significant other. We're going to go have dinner. Why? Well, guess what? Walking a mile a day for a week is not a big deal to most people. But that was a big deal to me. I'm going to celebrate. And then I'm going to run a mile every day. Once I've done that, have another celebratory dinner. And then once I've run a mile every day for a month, I'm going to celebrate by buying some new clothes. Because I'm not going to fit into my old pants because I'm getting fitter, right? And in that way, you would set up these short-term wins every mile of the way to take you to mile 26. Well, it's the same thing as these grandiose Vision 2020s, remove all harm in 5 years, they don't work if the next time we check in with people is in 5 years or in 2020. So you need to ask yourself, how are you going to reward the changers? How do you reward the people with courage to follow you? What kind of rewards will motivate behavior change in your organization? I can't tell you for you guys, but I'll tell you there's 2 things I use all the time. First thing I use as a reward, it's thank you. It's amazing how far an authentic thank you will go. People feel valued and they feel appreciated. So thanks is the first thing I use. The second thing I use is cake. Cake's like a tremendous motivator. And reward, right? Like people have some small win, I roll out the cake, right? Everybody feels appreciated. And the most important thing lives up there at the top. It's this concept of planning and creating. Don't do what I used to do, which is I would sit back and say, you know what, as soon as something big happens, then we'll celebrate. Well, guess what? Nothing big is ever going to happen, right? Because that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about small incremental change that eventually leads to something big. So plan and create these in advance, and as you're doing that, set the bar for success so low that even if people are failing, they will trip over the bar and feel like they've had some success, right? And then you roll out a cake. Right? Good. So we got that vision thing. We've got some strategies. We're removing obstacles. We're now celebrating our short-term wins. Step number 7 is around using your credibility for more change. And I'll tell you, after we did that stroke project, our hospitalist group, we had tremendous credibility, right? People started looking around and they're like, holy smokes, Mix, you got something done. They got excited. They got enthused. They started looking for the next QI project they could do. Culture, this year, was beginning to change. So step number 7 is about taking that short-term win, using the credibility you got, and then extending a little bit further, right? We got it to 37 minutes. Can we get it to 30 minutes? Can we get it to 25 minutes? Each step of the way, celebrating those short-term wins. And then step number 8 is about anchoring the new approaches in the culture. You begin to hire, promote, develop the kind of people who believe in what you're trying to do. And just as importantly, you stop hiring people who don't believe in it. And then you start to develop future goals that tie back into your new culture to bring this full circle. All right, we covered a lot of ground, so let me summarize where I think we've been. Started about 45 minutes ago talking about the current state of patient safety. Hopefully I convinced you that we have a significant problem. Then talked a bit about how some of these QI initiatives like checklists really can work, and how most often they don't. And the reason they don't is because they don't always have cultures that are willing to support them. And then I just walked you through 8 steps for how we can lead culture change, the 8 steps on the screen behind me. Now, throughout the course of my talk here, I wanted to try to weave in some cases. And I did that because I wanted to personalize this issue. If only one person died every year from medical errors, I suspect we'd all know that person's name. But it's not one person. It's 98,000 people. And that 98,000, that's a big number. And it makes it easy for us to get lost behind that big number. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to give you some of the names behind that number. Names like Tina, Jim, and Sarah, and Rory. And I want you to know that every one of those numbers has a name. Every one of those names has a story. Every one of those stories is being told by a loved one who was left behind. So for those of you who were paying attention to my title, which was 97,999 in Florence, you'll note 2 things. Number 1 is, despite the obvious allusion to the 98,000 deaths from medical errors in hospitals every year, not a single patient I showed you actually died from the medical error. The second thing you'd note is we've yet to meet Florence. So Florence is a 68-year-old woman with a history of AFib on warfarin. She was admitted with altered mental status. Head CT revealed a massive intracerebral bleed. Her INR was found to be 7.2, and on review of her chart, it was noted that she was given trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, or Bactrim, 1 week prior for a UTI. Now, despite the fact that there's a well-known interaction between Bactrim and warfarin that raises patients' INR, puts them at risk of intracerebral bleeding, Florence hadn't had an INR check in the week prior to her admission. In fact, Florence hadn't had an INR check in well over 3 months. But Florence didn't do well. Eventually, care was withdrawn, and she passed away, a victim of an error of omission. Now, before I leave you, there are just 2 very quick things I wanted to do. The first is I wanted to give you a little bit of homework. I'd like you to leave here today and think a little bit about what we talked about. Specifically, I'd like you to think about what is it going to take for you. What's going to be your burning platform? What is going to be your approaching the wall of flame? What is going to be your sense of urgency? What is it going to take for you to change? And the last thing I wanted to do before I close is I wanted to share something with you. I wanted to share with you my own personal burning platform, my own personal approaching wall of flame, my own personal sense of urgency. For me, my burning platform is my Aunt Florence. Thank you.
Thank you. That was both inspiring but also practical. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about critical mass of leadership and buy-in. Because one thing I've found is that you can have a personal passion and you can also attempt to bring other people into that, but there's only so much that one person can do. Do you have any advice or practical steps about how to create that critical mass for culture change?
Yes, a good question around how many people does it take to do this kind of work. Some would say it's the square root of the organization. So if you have X number, no, it's not the square root, it's whatever that is, right? It's not everybody. But what I would do is I would think back to that, if you've seen that diffusion of innovation curve, where you've got, when do people sort of do things like iPhone's a good example. Not everyone bought an iPhone the first day it came out. You have the innovators who were lined up waiting for it, right? Then you've got the early adopters. Then you've got the late adopters. Then you've got the people who've never bought an iPhone. I wouldn't go after the people who've never bought an iPhone, because because you're never going to get them, right? So I would try to figure out who are those innovators and those early adopters, and I would go after them. How you find them, I think you probably get a sense of who they are. Once you get them on board, you start doing good work, then start sort of proselytizing and tell people about it, and eventually you'll get to those sort of late adopters, and once you get to that late adopter group, that's when you got it. But it doesn't work with just the innovators. You have to get into some of those early adopters, and you have to show success. And once you start to do that, my sense is more and more people will get on board. My sense is that many people get skeptical about quality and safety because they think they're good providers, which we are. Hopefully I convinced you of that. We're all very good at what we're doing. But there's this sense that we sort of get tripped up, and then when we get experience with QI, it's an online module or something from the IHI, and like, well, that was kind of painful. And that doesn't really engender people to want to do it. So it's some of those early wins, and I commonly will go after efficiency as opposed to pure quality or safety, because efficiency people feel. If you say using these process improvement tools, we can reduce the amount of time you take on your electronic record. What we found in our primary care clinics is that providers, when they went home at night, this is faculty, took on average 1 hour and 51 minutes of time charting and doing the stuff they couldn't get done through the day. So we actually went after that. People were like, wow, you made my life better. What's next? As opposed to going after some of these harder things. So there's lots of strategy around it, but I would go after those sort of early adopters and innovators.
Yeah. The tracking of quality and safety has become an industry in its own right. Lots of money to be made, lots of money to be made by licensing quality and safety evaluation. It's driving us all nuts. It's an expensive process. Is it going to work? How is what we're doing now as a nation mandated? How is that going to be successful? It can be in your structure of your 8-step process. I mean, is there a chance?
Yeah, so kind of the question of is what we're doing now going to work? I would argue minimally to moderately that regulating quality works as long as you're regulating quality, right? The stop sign or the speed limit sign works as long as there's a policeman there monitoring it. But culture is what happens when nobody's looking, and until we get to the point where people are doing this kind of stuff when nobody's looking, that's when we will have won the game. So if we really want to do this, I don't think you can get it done through regulatory. Regulatory is sort of one mechanism to do it, but we ultimately have to get to a culture where 100% or as close to possible of people show up every day trying to improve the system. I think we are very far off from that, and we have a lot of work to do.
Just one more question.
How much of this is healthcare finances? This is, someone in a similar position to you when I was in residency. The example they used, they contrasted two clinics, but when I worked the second one. The first was kind of our regular clinic where we would have 8 patients scheduled. You were post-call, you were working in the hospital, and would come out to do your clinic, getting paged by the nurse about the patient you admitted last night, and so forth. And the other was he ran a pre-op clinic where they would schedule 3 patients, 1 attending, 1 resident, and after I spent an hour with the first patient and a half an hour presenting the patient, he said, "Now can you imagine making a medical error in this situation?" And I said, "Not really."
Yeah.
So how much is it that we're trying to see 8 patients and and do everything because that's what the health system is demanding of us?
Yeah. So question about sort of how do you tick all the boxes? Like it's great, I'll see 1 patient a day and I won't make any errors.
Right.
But talk about business. Some of that I would go back to just the efficiency of clinics. When we've looked at this now in multiple clinics, what we found is the average patient shows up to, for example, our spine clinic spends 54 minutes in a room. How much of that time is with a provider of any sort? 25. So the bulk of the time they're waiting. So if you can chunk that wait time out and focus on time with provider, you can actually expand the amount of time you can spend with him and still get them through faster and see a number of patients. So part of it is putting efficiency in there as well. But I think we need to figure out how to spend more time with patients, not less. But I would say in that particular case, chunk out all of the waste, which is significant. We've seen this in every clinic we've looked. Once you get rid of the waste, then you can come in and spend more time. Or what we're doing now is building in much more support for MAs to be able to do a lot of this charting and stuff that we're doing so that we can do what we're good at and only we can do, which is spend time with patients. So I'd say a lot of it is around building the support to be able to do the work in the way we want. But
it's hard to do because that takes an investment into that. So.
Dr. Glasheen, we have a tradition here. I was not going to hit it.
I haven't
I was
brought this
getting
up.
behind them.
It is better be good.
That each of our folks who come from other institutions will have one of these in their office. And this says Dr. J. Glasheen, 2015 C.C. Smith Lecturer, University of Louisville, April 16, 2015.
Well, this is fabulous. Thank you very much.
Oh, my 9-year-old.
I saw my name.